welcome. And I guess I'm going to start right out with ideas about calling, um, and the sense that it's more important at this time than at other times because the outside world is in such disarray and will continue to be that way, that there's a greater need for people to respond to their calling, because in the long run, the things that call to us tend to be beneficial not just for us, but for everyone. And so calling becomes a more important thing on the inside when the outside world is falling apart. Calling and vocation are part of the ancient sense of being born into an adventure of self-discovery that is aimed at awakening our greater inner consciousness and revealing our life purpose. What calls to us speaks to the personal myth that's already seated inside us. In other words, there's an inner story that's trying to unfold through the course of our life. And a key component of that unfolding is hearing and responding to the call, because in responding to the call, we align ourselves with the paths that are most meaningful to us, but can be the most beneficial for other people as well. Because when we find our path, we find ways to give our gifts, and everyone that comes into the world is gifted, and the gifts are intended to be given, and the beneficiaries are intended to be other people. So being alive at this time means being called to become more conscious of more realities of daily life. It means to be challenged to undertake an expansion of identity in order to avoid being overwhelmed by the flood of changes that are surging through both nature and culture. And it's in times of change that there can be an intensification of longing to find something meaningful, to find a true purpose and a genuine aim in life. And just as in periods of personal crisis, there can be an acceleration of calling in the midst of the confusion of the world. And so, in a sense, at least my sense is, the more people who respond to their calling, the more ways that people will find to bring healing, to bring meaning, to bring purpose to the world. And this is particularly important if we think about young people growing up into this world that turns upside down so often, into the conflicts and confusion that prevail in the world right now. More than at other times, young people benefit from knowing that there's a calling, and then being able to respond to something meaningful when there's less and less meaning in the world around them. Calling can happen at any age, but there is a special connection between youth and calling that we'll come back to a few different ways. So I just want to make some statements. I collect proverbs from all different places and quotes, and I think of them as vitamins or supplements for the mind and for the soul. And so this is one that I like. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. That's Kierkegaard. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. You can see the other side of that right away. Despair, by the way, means to be without hope. The more we are like who we are, the more hope we find in ourselves and in the world. I don't even know who said this, but the dilemma of who we are is typically solved in too narrow a way. We limit ourselves to the prescription of what is attainable, and we renounce the true potentials that our souls are trying to reveal to us all along. So most of us are living a life that is too narrow for the essence, for the imagination, and for the longing of our own souls. And it's strange, when the world is falling apart, that's the time to not miss the opportunity to expand the identity, to grow the soul, as they used to say. And this is a saying from the Renaissance. Whoever discovers their own genius will, in that discovery, find their own natural work and at the same time find their star and their daimon. Daimon is another word for genius, but it's a reference to the idea that there's a calling, and whoever discovers, unveils, reveals, makes connection to the calling, then finds their own genius, their own daimon, but their own natural work, and the star that they are intended to follow. And so that tells you that calling is connected to destiny. And then a little poem. The small ruby that everyone wants has fallen out on the road. And some think it's east of us, and others think it's west of us. Some say it's amongst the primal earth and rocks, others that it must be found in the deepest waters. But listen, Kabir's holy instinct told him that it was inside us all along, and it was inside trying to be revealed, and when it's revealed, then we know what that ruby was truly worth. And so Kabir wrapped it carefully in his heart cloth. So that's Kabir, 13th, 14th century in India, writing about the thing that everybody wants, the genius, the calling, the destiny, the aim. People think it's here, outside, east, west, it's in all kinds of places, but the holy instinct tells us it's inside us all along. And so the calling is calling to something inside us that intends to, that's trying to, that would, if possible, awaken. We'll keep coming back to that. So I want to continue with the idea that when the world is in difficult circumstances, and when we're personally in difficult circumstances, there can be an acceleration of calling. In a sense, we're closer to what's calling to us when we're in turmoil or in difficulty, because we loosen up our sense of self and we know that we're missing something, and that makes us more available to the call. And often when we're looking to find where was the calling in my life, often the place to look was where the greatest trouble was. So whether it comes as a daunting challenge or a crushing blunder, as a big dream or a penetrating loss, each major life event can be the opening, for calling to come to us. Each major life crossroads can be the opportunity to awaken to the call, which you could say is calling to the genius in us, calling to the soul in us, or calling to the deeper self, if you want to use a psychological term. And so from the view of the soul, having a calling is not a matter of choice or just another option in the course of life. Rather, it is the thing that's trying to choose us. In the modern world, people want to have lots of choices, and that's fine. But there's an old idea that says that it's more important to be chosen than to have choices. And being chosen is another way to talk about vocation or being called to something meaningful. So finding a calling in life is a key to opening up one's own life and also to becoming purposeful in life. And in that sense, a calling creates a threshold, creates an opening through which the timeless threads of destiny and imagination, of love and meaning try to pull us. The modern world is restricted by a kind of collapse of imagination, which has caused everything to be horizontal. But calling has to do with verticality. We're called to something higher. We're called to something greater. We're called to something deeper. The soul grows by vertical dimensions, not by horizontal expansion. So a chance experience, a mistake, a dream, anything large or small can serve as the opening for a calling. And an accident, for instance, can turn out not to be an accident at all. It can shift a person's life towards a destiny that was waiting to be found and needed that accident to be revealed. And so you could say an act of vocation happens whenever and wherever spirit calls to us. In other words, it's not a once in a time in life thing, and if you miss it, too bad, you don't have a calling. It's actually calling all the time. And there can be little acts of vocation where we have more of a recognition of how we are called and why we are called and where we are called to go. And when you look at it that way, spiritual paths can be seen as pathways coming from a calling. It's a way to understand how to pick which or find your way through the spiritual possibilities. The path to take is the one we're called to take. And once we realize that calling, nothing else should be allowed to interfere with that, because that is the alignment with the depth of our own soul, and nothing can improve upon that. So it's my sense that calling comes to everyone. There's the old saying that many are called but few are chosen. But I don't see it that way. There's another way to see it, that everyone is called, but not everyone responds to the call. So there's always been a problem with responding to the call. I think it's a greater problem now, but I think we have to look at the things that get in the way of the calling. And so in modern life, one of the first problems becomes how to hear the call amidst the distractions, the confusions, the excess of information and misinformation. The rapid communication and confusion of the modern world is interfering with the channels through which the calling can come. This is particularly true now for young people, I would say, because they're left to their own devices and they're engaging with other kind of signals and often missing the signal that's trying to awaken their own soul. But that's true for all of us at the same time. Another factor of modern life that makes it harder to find the call or hear the call or confirm the call or recognize the call is the fact that cosmologically we're lost. The modern world has no center. The old forms of cosmology had centers. The Earth was at the center, then the sun was at the center, and then they figured out there's nothing at the center. And that caused people to think that the whole thing is an accident. What they didn't realize, when there's nothing specifically at the center, any place in the world, in the galaxy, can become the center. And by the way, that which calls to us is calling from the center. It's calling from the center of the cosmos, in a sense. That was a really old idea. And it's calling to the center of us. And so when we get lost cosmologically, when we don't have a living myth that makes sense to people, when we don't understand our position in the cosmos, we become more distant from the possibility of calling. Most people think, because modern science says that the world is accidental, then that they too are accidental. And an accidental person is likely to not find the call. And so we almost need a different cosmological understanding to realize that we are here to awaken to who we already are and to respond to the call, which will lead us into meaningful pathways through which we not only satisfy our own spiritual longings, but we also bring something to a world that needs spiritual healing and healing on all kinds of other levels. So the call actually affects not just the individual soul, but each individual soul is connected to the world. So losing the calling means the world loses something as well. So another aspect of modern life that's in the way of the calling coming through, and this is getting at the kind of emptiness inside people, there's two basic ideas about what's inside or what the soul inside a person is. And one of them is called tabula rasa, which is Latin for a scraped clean table. And so the idea is that the soul of a person is blank. And once they're born, everybody starts writing on their soul, the parents and the neighbors and siblings and everybody, school teachers, and that they are the sum of what's written on them or what's impressed into them by others. Tabula rasa. The other idea, which is the most common idea in all traditional cultures around the world and most mythologies around the world, is each person is born with a distinct inner spirit, that each person comes into the world with the spirit that is inside that's trying to awaken, and that the spirit, that inner spirit, is distinct. You might say, in fact, it's unique. and that's what a person has come to awaken to realize the uniqueness of their own inner spirit, and the calling is calling to the unique spirit that's already there. That dynamic is really important. The calling that comes from the outside is calling to something that already exists on the inside in the form of an inner spirit, a unique spirit, a genius, a daimon. There's lots of names for it. But there's something in the person that has come here to become known by the person and to deliver things to the world. And that's what the calling is about. I just say one more thing about the uniqueness. Because the modern world is so absorbed with collective ideas, and people are counted as part of groups. They're part of a voting group. They're part of a purchasing group. They're part of a ethnic group. They're part of a generation. And what's been lost is the unique individuality of each person. The calling can only come to the individual soul. The individual soul is the essence and the most meaningful part of the person. Each person born is unique, will never live again. Many people will live, but not that person. And people doubt that in the modern world because of the accidental universe and ideas like tabula rasa. But if you think about it, nature only makes originals. No two trees are the same. No two birds are the same. No two living souls are the same. Each person is unique. And when the calling strikes and a person responds, they begin to live in a unique way, which is satisfying and meaningful to them, but which is also instructive and educational for others. You can think of the people who have passed on, famous people. I was quoting some of them, and how they left their mark because they lived a unique life. And they all, no matter who they are, spiritual, artistic, what kind of person they were, they all answered a call. That's the old understanding. The soul is unique, and there's a call trying to connect to that uniqueness and awaken the person from within. From outside, it feels like a call. From inside, it's experienced as an awakening. And we're supposed to have that experience. As a matter of fact, the soul expects to have that experience. So Ralph Waldo Emerson said, when nature has work to be done, she creates geniuses to do it. He's making the distinct connection between human genius and nature. And then, in a sense, saying that the call is coming from nature, in a sense. You can say it's coming from the center of the cosmos, it's coming from God, it's coming from the angelic realm, it's coming from nature. You can write the story the way you want to write it. The important thing is that the calling is coming from the outside in order to awaken something already present inside. And then that shows you that that thing trying to awaken in us is secretly connected to the world, connected to nature, connected to the spiritual realm, connected to the possibilities of being creative. All reasons why the calling is so important. Excuse me. But a problem comes from this uniqueness also. In other words, another problem with calling is that because each person is unique and because the calling is calling to the unique spirit of the person, the calling can come in surprising, unexpected ways. And as a matter of fact, since the soul is unique, the calling can come in a unique way as well. And that means there's no overall pattern or general map to follow because it is the unique inner pattern of the soul that is the aim of the calling. I'm trying to say there's a built-in problem. And I know people like to know how many steps there are and what's the first step. And people like to have a schema or a schematic. But because the soul is unique, and because the expression of the soul is intended to be unique also, the calling can come in unique ways. And that's one reason why it's not a simple subject in high school with everybody knowing what's going on. There's a mystery in it. And the mystery is partly the uniqueness of the soul. And another part of the mystery is the fact that the unique soul is connected to the soul of the world, to the heart of nature. And so something mysterious is happening, and that's why it's a little hard to define it and say, here's how you look for it, and here's how you find it. It's mysterious in its own way, and it involves a person partially solving the mystery of their own life, and therefore the process can be mysterious as well. So another problem that interferes with hearing the call and responding to the call is what I call received ideas. In other words, each soul born is born into a family. The family and the parents have nothing necessarily to do with the calling of their own children. Typically, the parents do not know the calling or the destiny of their own children. They're not supposed to, because that inside the child that is waiting to awaken is not something that is derived from the DNA of the parents. It's something that is unique to the child coming into the world, and therefore it's by definition not a derivative of the parents. And yet, because in the modern world, people don't understand that. I'll give an example. The origin of birthday candles, lighting a candle, was one candle that would be lit each time the person had a birthday, regardless of their age. And the lighting of the candle would be the recognition that they had come in when they were born with a flame inside them. And the birthday candle, which we now still do, originated as the lighting of the flame of a candle in the house of the person having the birthday, in order to recognize that a flame of life, a spirit of imagination, a part of the eternal flame came into the world with that person, and birthday gifts would be given to the genius, not to the person. I'm just showing how something could change over time. And now we think our birthday has to do with the family, for instance, which is true on one level, and that's fine. But I'm talking about something about what burns inside a person, what longs inside of a person to be seen as something lighting a path through life. That is what the birthday used to be about, the recognition that a genius, a spirit, had come into the world with each child born, and that child born was not simply a derivative of the parents, but was actually partly generated by the unseen world of spirit. And that's why some children, I was one of them, can say, I don't know what I'm doing in this family. How did I wind up in this group? And you can have parents who say, I don't know where this child came from. She's not like anyone else in the whole family. Because the actual spirit of the children is not derived or generated by the family per se. So the problem then develops that not only the family can't recognize the genius or the spirit or the calling of their own children, that's the setup, so that the children will leave home and go and try and find the calling and find their own lives. But in the meantime, the children are receiving ideas. I call it received ideas from the parents, from school, from the community. And received ideas get in the way of that core image idea that's trying to awaken from inside the person. And so if a person has certain received ideas about how life works, or if there's a heavy dose of some kind of fundamentalist belief system or something, that will obscure the spirit that's trying to awaken in that child. And so by saying that, I'm also saying that this inner spirit, this thing that is being called to, this genius, this daimon, is not usually a part of religion either. It's actually this unique thing that makes each person worthy of respect, care, and love, because they are unique and will never be born again. And it's a hard thing in the modern world, but it's actually a valuable thing to begin to imagine oneself that way, not to be inflated because everyone else is that way. Oscar Wilde said something like, be yourself because everyone else is taken. In two little lines, he has the whole idea there. Be your unique self because everyone else is a unique self. And I'm going back to thinking about children and younger people. When they see an older person living in what appears to be a meaningful way with an enlivened spirit in their life and being kind of unique and possibly weird, they're encouraged. Because inside they have a feeling for that, but they haven't been shown or been given permission or been invited into living that way. But when they see someone doing it, they recognize it. So until a person hears the call and responds to the call, then the key elements of their own psyche and their soul remain latent or dormant or hidden. And so that a person can inherit wealth or gain great status in the world, and yet they can feel and be empty inside because they have no genuine sense of their inner worth. And if that's the case, then they have very little to offer to other people despite wealth or fame or power. You could say another issue with hearing and responding to the call is an issue of courage, because it takes a certain kind of courage to follow what truly calls to us. It usually doesn't agree with the family dynamics and the family expectations, and it certainly doesn't agree with our inner psychological structure, the ego, or I call it the little self. In other words, if we're going to hear the call and respond to it, we're going to have to move beyond the limitations of the ego, beyond the expectations of the ego, and we're going to have to face the fears of the ego, because the calling calls a person to a necessarily bigger life in psychological terms and in spiritual terms and in emotional terms. So even though everyone has a calling, it's easier to walk a predictable path and follow the maps made by others than to find the courage to step onto that pathless path that turns out to be the path that we were called to take. And so that's why, one reason why I'm saying that when the world is falling apart, when life becomes dark and uncertain, there's more reason to follow a calling, because the expected things, the secure things, the safe pathways aren't existing anyway. So then why not go the whole hog and step off the map and go into the places where we are called, which are always, the calling always takes us off the maps that are made by others. And just to repeat, we have to, in some sense, loosen our ego attitudes in order to make room for the calling and the vision of our own lives to be able to enter the space and affect our psychological inner territory. And so those things that cause the ego to be stuck or break down actually make us more available to calling. And so if we're going to look back through our lives to see when did the calling happen or where might it have happened, you can look in places where something really bright happened, and maybe it was only momentary, and then we lost the grip on it, or people took it away from us. I don't know. But also you can look where the worst things happened, where we were rejected, we were locked up, we had a breakdown. And how we survived that, if we really examine it, will often have traces and hints of the calling and the inner genius. And so one place to look for where the calling might have been, in other words, by the time a person is early 20s, they've experienced the call whether they know it or not. In other words, this is not a matter of options and choices. It happens. But because of all the things I was naming, the limitations of family, the kind of lack of imagination and culture, the restrictions of poverty, the rejections because of gender or because of lifestyle, all those kind of things can get in the way of realizing that the calling had come. And then we have to go back into those broken places and perhaps find the root or the seed or the remnant of the calling there. Going back over one's life to see, because when the calling occurs, it leaves a mark. It leaves its own trace. And so we can trace back to find the calling because it leaves traces in our lives. Having said that, it's necessary for me at least to say that a person's calling is not necessarily heroic. The modern Western world has become, somewhat obsessed with the notion of heroicism, the hero's journey, the hero's myth, and Joseph Campbell, who was a great person and did a lot of good work, made the mistake of calling it a monomyth. And what I mean by a mistake is myth is multiple by its own nature. There is no single story. There's the multiplicity of stories. And so the calling doesn't necessarily call a person into a hero's journey. It can call a person into all kinds of things that don't look like that at all. And so, and once again, when the world is falling apart, we don't need more heroes. The heroicism of the Western mind is partly what has us in the trouble we're in, the exaggerated sense of heroics. Calling is not dependent on notions of the hero. It's closer to creation myths than it is to heroes' journeys. And creation myths come in all kinds of forms and shapes, just as the callings come in all kinds of forms and shapes. And what calls to a person, again, is unique, and it cannot be defined by a simple number of steps or be recognized by certain expectations. It can have its own unique style and its own way of getting our attention. And the thing, our own inner spirit, has its own style. So people can be called onto a similar journey, but they will each live it uniquely, and they will each bring a different style to it, just the way that every cello player has a different style, as every flute player does, and every dancer does. So let's see. There's no general map to follow, and that makes the whole prospect of calling more mysterious and makes it more necessary to reflect more deeply, to find the traces of calling and to learn what we're being called to do. Okay. Failing to answer the call can cause a depression of spirit. The call is calling to the unique spirit of the person. Failing to answer it can naturally cause a depression of spirit. As a matter of fact, the word depression used to mean a loss of spirit. And at the same time, spirit and soul are both expecting and awaiting the call. And then failing to respond to the call has a damaging effect, depressing effect on the spirit and also on the soul. Failing to answer the call means to live an unexplored life, to have the key territory of one's inner life be not explored. And it can also sadly mean dying without having fully lived. So in a sense, either we awaken to the true nature and inner spirit of our life by responding to the call, or we wind up living a distortion or a perversion of it. I'm making this extreme because, in a sense, that's how it is for the soul. The callings pull us into extreme places where we have to expand our sense of self, and we have to open our hearts and our minds and our bodies to being understood in a way that's different from what culture says and family says and our own ego says. The calling calls us into a greater adventure, which they used to call the second adventure of life. The first adventure is just to be born and to survive infancy and to grow as the body grows. And the second adventure is to hear the call and awaken to the journey, to the path, to the elements of our own life that are intended to unfold into the world. So I see there are questions. How might we respond to a call that seems to take us away from the people we love? Well, I mean, the immediate answer for me is mournfully and sadly, but we might have to go. I mean, I appreciate the question because it picks up this idea that we're being called to something that depends upon and tries to bring forth the uniqueness in our own lives. And that can mean, and it does mean, typically early on separating from the family, the members of whom we love, but who cannot satisfy our need for spiritual growth, for imaginative life. The family is set up not to provide that. And so in responding to the call, we are often separating from those that we are most connected to, and it can be, and it can feel like and be like separating from those we love. I would also say this: those who love us the most would bow to that separation because they could see that it meant we were moving into the life we came here to live. I'm making a very strong argument of the individual, the unique individual soul in contrast to the collective sphere of life. Modern life is about isms. It's about collective things. And those things are important, but all ancient cultures thought that it was way more important that the individual soul awakens, because that brings more spirit, imagination, more vitality to not just the individual, but to the collective. So, yes, there can be, by the way, separation from those we love is the first step of initiation. You can think about it that way also. A rite of passage begins by separating from those we love. Rite of passage is connected to a calling. In a rite of passage is often when we first people traditionally would first receive the calling. How does the sense or purpose of a calling change as we approach the end of our lives or go into our 7th or 8th decades? Another good question, because this is the other end. Typically, the calling comes during youth. That's the classic time for a calling, because the youth is just awakening, is just growing emotionally and psychologically and spiritually. The body has attained some growth, and now the inner parts are trying to grow, and that's when the calling usually comes. But there's a saying that I like that says the calling keeps calling. And when we find a life that's a path that's meaningful, there's no end to it. There's no end to initiation. There's no end to learning. There's no end to spiritual quest. It keeps going. So what I would say about the later phases of life, since I find myself in them, 2 things I would say. One is being connected to a calling and thereby being also connected to the inner genius, I'll call it, the inner spirit. That's what keeps a person young while they're getting old. And then I would say, in terms of a person who's living a meaningful life, has found a calling or found a path, maybe found it, lost it, found it again, whatever. It's never a perfect, adventure. It becomes really more important to speak from that place. In other words, I'm doing it now. I wrote a book about genius, and I talk about it, have for many years, to young people, to almost anyone who will listen. But because I think it's so important, and I become less guarded or careful about how I do it as I get older, because sometimes it's the saying of it that has the value and has the meaning, and rather than being worried about whether it's being understood or something like that. And so if people have lived meaningful lives, then towards the end, they should be acting from the sense of meaning, trying not to force people to hear things, but actually trying to, there's an old saying that if you don't give away what you've learned, then it becomes a burden on your soul. And so when we get to the later stages of life, we're supposed to unburden our souls. And one way to do that is to give whatever we have learned. And we learn the most when we are on the path we are called to be on. How does a sense... Okay, I did that. I've been helping immigrants who have escaped the turmoil of violent countries. We've been working together to help them find a path to stability, but we've hit a brick wall. The system is brutal and hard, and I'm so tired. Is it possible my calling can shift? Can callings begin as one labor of love and then change? Yes, they can. The whole thing is this spiritual, emotional growth. And I feel for I understand what you're saying. I feel for it. Through Mosaic, we've been working with refugees, and we working with, and young kids lost on the street, and people in prisons and all kind of things. And so you put everything you have into it because you know that it's needed, but you also know that in giving to people who are in those kind of states, they actually are closer to awakening sometimes because everything else has broken down. And then you get burned out. And they're always hitting brick walls. The systems are against the awakening of the individuals. That's just the way it is. And that's why I'm talking so much about the uniqueness of the individual soul. And so, yes, I think a person can move from one area to another. I mean, we literally, in the course of Mosaic over the last 40 years, have gone from working with at-risk youth, which we continue to work with, but also went into a period of working with refugees, particularly from Africa, and then went into an extensive period of working with people in prison, and then went into another phase of working with battle veterans. And it was all the same work. It was just anywhere that someone is broken, anywhere that people are lost, anywhere that people are longing for something, any kind of nourishment physically, but nourishment emotionally, nourishment spiritually, and nourishment imaginally, were all places to work. And when I look at them, they're all related. And yet there was a need to move from one to another at different times. So yeah, I think there's it's part of the road. Is if it's really stuck, then usually we have to move on, and you can change the direction or change the calling remains. The style of the work can remain, but you can move to a different vector where it's more alive again. I'll say something else about working and giving of oneself, which is a great thing to do. But if it's all giving of oneself and nothing's coming back, something's wrong. Then you're on some kind of a do-gooder mission, and it doesn't pay off. The places where we give of ourselves, we have to be getting something back that nourishes ourselves, or we actually have misunderstood the dynamic of it. Is it common to experience moving towards your calling as a life or death experience? Moving toward my call has felt as if my heart will stop. Every time I get to a threshold, my heart palpitates and stops me from moving ahead for fear of death. How can you manage the symptoms and still explore? Again, thank you. Meaningful change feels like a life and death experience. It's not life or death, it's life and death. And so for responding to a calling can be partially like dying. The old self, that's why I was talking about the ego self, which thinks we're made this way and that way. The ego self is built out of fearful experiences during infancy. And it fears that any big move or any transcendent experience will cause annihilation. And so there is a kind of spiritual death or emotional death or something that happens every time we step into a bigger stage or phase of life. And the way of understanding that is the process of initiation, which begins with separation and then also includes a dying away. And so life in the form of nature, in the form of the galaxies and the cosmos, is constantly transforming. Transform means to move from one form to another, and in order to move to the next form, the previous form has to die. And so in growing the soul, the ego dies a little. In following the calling, the ego dies again. The calling is at odds with the ego, and we're intended to actually die in order to grow a bigger life. The Irish have the proverb, death is the middle of a long life. We're supposed to die little deaths in order to grow. And initially it can feel to the ego like this is really, I'm going to die. And so good breathing exercises would help. And then the realization that something is dying every time we grow. That's what happens in nature all the time, except somehow modern people got the idea that a person is supposed to be the same throughout their life. We're supposed to be a radically different person at the end than we were at the beginning. If we have a calling, that's what will happen. What can I do now if my family repeatedly squash my calling and my abilities to express it? Being an adult, I'm struggling to put my calling into action. Again, thank you for the honesty. I mean, that really happens. I've experienced it many times. My mother, may she rest in peace, when I was younger would say things, well, just don't ever be an artist. And then I felt like I was being called to do things that might be like creative and even like write a book. And I had to wrestle with that idea, which was a little bit like a spell. So we're often having to break the spells that we lived within when we couldn't do anything about it because we were dependent. And so then it becomes a matter of being clear with oneself. This comes up every time I try to write, or this comes up every time I try to sing, or every time I try to make a meaningful creative step, then this stuff comes back. And that can be the case. And then we have to understand that we're going to survive that. We're going to live through that. I talk about genius. I talk about the unique soul. I talk about the deep self, because when we know that those things exist inside us, we can feel less like we're going to die because things are changing. In other words, that's what I'm talking about. Why I'm talking about the calling and the spirit and the genius, because if we don't know that, I don't mean mentally only, know that in our body and know that in our heart, then we are afraid to take those steps that we are really called to take. And taking those steps, just like leaving home and then not going to take the classes they said to take. You know what I'm talking about. A career is one thing, and it can be a very good thing, but a calling is something else. And the calling separates us from the typical common definitions and descriptions of what a person is. And in order to follow that, aspects of ourselves that are received ideas or impressed psychological components have to be shed in order to be fully available to the calling, in order to expand the soul, and in order to grow a greater identity than the one we were given. Can you address calling with chronic incapacitating illness? Thank you again, and I'm very sorry about that. And I wish I had a whole lot more to say about it. But I know, sadly, that there are many people that live with chronic, painful, incapacitating illnesses, and yet the spirit exists inside that and beyond that. And the calling can go beyond it. I mean, there are famous painters who only had 2 toes to paint with. People have found ways to talk when they had no voice. I don't know, you might know more about it than I do. What I would just say is we can be incapacitated many ways, but the capacity of the inner spirit of a person is not diminished by that. And I don't know how a person works their way through it, but I'm just making the statement that no person is intended to have a small life, because no person has a small soul. And the spirit of one's life can endure through all kinds of things. And I'm really sorry for that chronic pain. You said a calling is not a hero's journey. I said it didn't have to be. But as I understand it, responding to the call is in itself a form of initiation, a journey, a rite of passage, as you just said. Is that journey a hero's journey? And I'm saying no. I'm sorry, but I just want to break a bubble on this thing. The hero's journey is a great type of story. It's a great pathway. It's meaningful. It is not the only story. A rite of passage has nothing necessarily to do with a hero's journey. And the reason why I want to make that clear is because the heroics and the hero's journeys typically are too muscular. They're very outward aimed. They're more masculine than feminine. And they wind up being overblown in a culture like this, which is materialistic and kind of excessively expressive in external ways. And so some people get to be heroes, and the rest of the people, I don't know, we won't name that. But the main thing is, some people's calling is to be an empathic person. That's a non-heroic journey, believe me. And so I'm just trying to say that even though, all right, specifically in Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell, before he lays out the hero's journey, says that he got the idea from Arnold van Gennep's Rites of Passage, a 1909 book, published in France. And the idea of rites of passage has nothing to do with the hero. It has to do with separation from common circumstances and those we typically know, entering a period of liminality and uncertainty in which there's an awakening of some kind. It can have a call, but it's certainly an awakening of a spiritual nature, and it is not by definition heroic. It can be any number of things beyond that. And so I usually talk about the inner genius rather than, and the calling to genius. So the old idea is that the calling is calling to the genius in the soul. Genius is an old Latin word that means the spirit that's already there, the spirit that's there when we're born. And some people will be born into a somewhat of a heroic journey. Other people will be born in completely different things, studying mushrooms and the way that mushrooms live under the roots of trees and connect everything. A very, inside, quiet work that has not necessarily any heroic qualities to it, but also because of the hero tending to be seen in this masculine, strong shape. It leaves too many people out. It leaves the whole feminine out sometimes. It leaves all kinds of children that have, non-heroic, natural ways that they would enter the world. So I'm trying to refer to something bigger. The hero's journey is a smaller part of a bigger capacity for all kinds of journeys. And whereas the hero's journey is typically someone is called to be the hero, everyone has genius by virtue of being born. And so if we're going to change the world, heroics is not going to change it. In many ways, it has made the world worse at this time. If we're going to change the world, we're going to need as many genius selves awakening to the calling as possible, with no definition of what that means and no steps laid out predetermined. That's how I'm seeing it. Okay. Well, I was already going into part 2, I guess, so I'll just keep going. All right. So I'm just repeating. The dynamic is that the calling is calling to the inner spirit of the person, the genius it used to be called. The Greek word was the daimon. There's lots of names for it in different cultures, but it's an essence inside the soul, and it's a spirit essence. That's what the calling is calling to. And since that inner essence, that inborn spirit is unique, then the calling and the pathways can be unique. And that's another reason why I'm trying to open up the territory of imagination and not restrict it to a hero's journey, because that has limits when you look at it. And it also has exclusions that I think are damaging to too many people in culture. All right. So then I want to call it, because it's a really good word, genius. The Greek word is daimon. They're very similar. But genius in the modern world has come to be something that people think they can measure. You can have a genius IQ, or you can have a genius talent for music, or a talent for business or something. But that's not what it means. It doesn't mean something quantifiable. It means a quality in a person that defies quantification. So sometimes the genius of a person does turn out to be a bright intellect or a specific talent. But in other people, it's a surpassing capacity for imagination, or an inspired way of innovation. Or, as I mentioned, someone can have the genius of empathy or the genius of compassion. And so I'm imagining the world wants all those different kinds. And right now the world needs all those different variations of genius, because they lead people to places that others won't go. Those who do healing, those who are called to be healers, usually do not live a heroic life. In the modern world, you get surgeons that are at the top of the medical fields and all that kind of stuff. But that's not healing. That's something else. It's medical procedure. Healing is something else. And so the old word for the healers, the real healers, was the wounded healers. And so when someone lives the calling to be a healer, they are in touch with pain all the time. They encounter things that they can't heal. They become humble. They become closer to the earth. They become closer to the sense of compassion because they feel the pain of other people and because there's no heroic way to end the pain of people. So the genius can take many forms. And right now, when all kinds of healing, all kinds of innovation, all kinds of invention are needed, we need as many genius awakenings as possible. And I'm suggesting that when the world is in this kind of collapsing shape and in great need, that there's also an acceleration of calling. It's very hard to find satisfaction in a world that is so full of uncertainty and conflict. And so rather than seeking it outside, the idea is you seek it inside. And it's important then to realize inside is this unique genius of each person. And that's what the calling is trying to reach and awaken and inspire. William Blake put it this way: threads of genius and purpose are present in everyone, but may only become visible when something creative is attempted. In other words, we attempt to be creative in our life, we have a much greater possibility of revealing our own genius threads and the purpose of our lives and hearing the call. So Carl Jung put it this way, and this has to do with where do you look for the genius. He said, genius hides behind the wound. So in other words, if you get to the place where a person is wounded, you're actually close to their genius. Genius hides behind the wound. When I am close to in my own wounded state, even though it doesn't feel that way, I'm actually closer to the genius because genius and the deep wounds of the soul reside together. And that means that, and going back to the question that someone had, answering the call will awaken our genius and stir our wounds. And so the path of awakening involves both becoming more conscious of who we are in our essence and how we are intended to engage life and give to life, but it also puts us on the role of healing. Answering the call puts us on the role of awakening and also on the road of healing. And that's what we're supposed to be doing in this world. I mean, there's all kinds of modern ideas and all kinds of modern opportunities and da-da-da. But the human soul is here to grow and to transform, to awaken and become aware of its own inner nature and learn to live and express and give from that inner essence. That's the old idea. I'm sticking with that one. And so then Horace, the old Roman writer, put it this way: adversity reveals genius, prosperity conceals it. We find ourselves in adverse times. So the implication would be there's going to be more calling, more revelation of genius. And prosperity can conceal exactly those things. When a person thinks they have everything, they can't hear the call. They think they've arrived, when in fact they may be just in a way station in a materialistic territory. So, so going back to the nature of genius, which means the spirit that's already there, and I mentioned that the Greek term that was similar was daimon, either spelled D-A-E-M-O-N or D-A-I-M-O-N. And that's an interesting term because the daimon is the unique spirit of each person seen through Greek tradition. But when the daimon is not related to, when the daimon is not accepted, when the call connected to it is rejected or suppressed, then the daimon turns into a demon. That which is trying to awaken us, in us, and give us our own particular type of vitality and creativity, if it is suppressed, rejected, or dismissed, does not simply disappear, it can turn into the demon. And so that's another way of saying how important it is that a person awaken to what naturally calls to them, because then if a person doesn't do it, it doesn't mean they live a neutral life. It means that they are living closer to the demonic side of their life than to the genius creative side of their life. That's how ancient people saw it, that this was a serious thing. And you can see that in the cold-heartedness that grows inside modern cultures, in the willingness of many people in modern Western societies, but also other places, to reject other people, to denigrate other people, to not only disparage people, but to be cruel and mean to them. That's become an aspect of modern cultures. And you could say that's the demonic side of the unlived genius callings. Because when a person responds to the call of their life, they will wind up giving something meaningful to others. That's the old argument. I can't prove it, but I like the idea that what is inside people at the deepest sense and the depth of the soul is of its own nature beneficial to life. And so it's worth struggling for, but when it is not struggled for, it then manifests in ways that are inauthentic and demeaning to humanity. Okay. As this indigenous inner spirit of our life, the genius is the source of our genuine identity. When we fail to recognize it, it creates great identity problems. One way to understand the massive identity problems happening in major Western cultures is people who are not connected to themselves in some kind of inner essence way are now believing anything that anyone makes up. I'm talking about conspiracy theories. I'm talking about political movements that intend to rise by putting other people down. In order to do that, a person has to already think that those other people don't count. But in order to think other people don't count, we have to first feel inside ourselves that we don't count. And that causes people to believe in outside things that don't make sense, but fill a certain gap in their life. And then usually that outside thing means you can only be better by other people having a worse condition. And then there you are, the us and them has happened. You can have us and them when people are working on their own genuine inner identity. What you get is us and we. And so I'm trying to say that we don't improve the world by agreeing on one idea. We improve the world by each of us finding the core ideas and the deep imaginations in our own lives, and that those lead to meaningful callings, and that those lead to meaningful pathways. And when that happens, everyone starts to get a little benefit from it. And the next thing, the collective changes because of the awakening of individuals within it. That's why I'm so interested in calling and suggesting that when things get very broken as they are now, the calling can get through more readily. This inner genius also has been called the guardian angel. In other words, when we find the connection to the genius, it causes us to step into territories that are bigger and can seem threatening or be certainly overwhelming, but it also acts as a guide. So the genius or the daimon is a guide from within that also helps protect us. We are less protected when we are not living the life we have been called to live. It's not that we can avoid all dangers and all, but we get a certain kind of protection by being in alignment with our inner soul and the spirit of our own life. You get protection out of that. I'm saying in a world where protection is harder and harder to find, rather than seeking outside security, what we're really being called to do is to find the natural security of our own inner lives. And just having said that, another thing about genius, and I'm talking about genius because that's what the calling is calling to. Whereas a person has to grow up, the genius comes full blown. inborn, full blown, fully grown. The genius is there from the beginning, as it's not a human element, it's spirit, and it's there full born. So that's why you can have prodigies sometimes, child prodigies, or a person, responds to the call and suddenly everything changes and they're able to create in ways that they never imagined. They're able to invent, to innovate, to see and understand, because the genius itself, the daimon itself, is full born and full blown. And so the old statement was, genius is born, not made. And in saying that, I'm speaking against the idea that if you do something 1,000 times, you can become a master. Maybe you can, but to master oneself, a person has to awaken to what's inside, not simply repeat some practice or outside activity. That's how I'm saying it. Okay. Just to related to that, so each person has an inner genius, and that means that each person is gifted in some way. It's not that everyone is a genius, that everyone has some genius. And having some genius means having some gifts or talents. The old word was talents. And it's interesting to me that if you change 2 letters in the word talent, you get latent. Talent means the gift a person has to give, and latent means the gift is hidden or suppressed and it hasn't come out yet. And so there's a beautiful connection between latency and talent. And I just find that part of the poetry of genius. So a child simply grows up, but in order to become a full person, then that child has to be born again. And that's the second birth, the soul birth, the psychological birth, and the spiritual birth. And that is another way to refer to the awakening of the soul. And that's another way to characterize the condition in which the calling comes in. So it's come up several times in so far in this discussion, which is the idea that modern people typically lack a genuine rite of passage. A rite of passage is a natural expectation of the human soul, and it's something that's been lost. And so we're all missing typically this experience where we're separated from everybody, and then we go into a descent into darkness of some kind. Someone is put into a dark hut somewhere. Sometimes people are actually partially buried, or someone is put inside the hollow center, a trunk of an old tree. If someone is in a cave, someone is on a vision quest exposed on a mountainside. All these different things would be done in order to expose the person to nature on one hand, but also to the cosmos on another level. And the point of it was to have a vision, to have an awakening, to have, in a sense, a calling that tells them who they are already. Not who they're going to become simply, but who they already are. And so if a person was born into a certain kind of indigenous tribe, then that would involve typically an animal, which becomes then the totem animal or the guiding animal, that kind of the guiding spirit. Those kind of things were the ways in which people encountered calling, typically during times of youth. And that has kind of disappeared from modern culture, but the archetypal sense of it can't disappear. Young people are crashing into the world, driving cars too fast, trying drugs, experimenting with all kinds of things in order to find that which they haven't found yet, which turns out to be a connection to their own inner spirit and their own depth of soul. And so often people are missing the second birth, which is the birth that is out of childhood. And in that sense, going back to the question earlier, they used to refer to the childhood as dying. And the person was then going to live from that phase into the next phase. And the next phase would involve dreams and visions, awakening experiences that are all connected to finding, having, and enacting a calling in life. So the birth of genius, or the birth of the genius self, you could call it, is part of a second birth that is typically absent in terms of formal process in the modern world. And yet it's an archetypal element of the soul, and it can't disappear. So you can go back and look through your own life at critical periods. And if you look with the eye of imagination or the eye of initiation, you can see how certain things were as if vision quests, as if death and rebirth experiences. And I sometimes get concerned about telling this too much, but I've also written about it. And what got me started studying all these things was winding up in solitary confinement in a prison during the 60s, related to not being willing to fight in the Vietnam War kind of thing. But the important part of it was that I wound up isolated in a small cell, separate from everyone I loved, everyone I knew, and everything I expected. And instead of disappearing or just, melting into depression and despair, I found something inside myself that was alive and that was connected, in my case, to mythological stories. As if those stories were not just interesting things, they were alive in me. They actually saved me in that experience. And that gave me this sense of what you could get in a vision quest. In other words, I died in that cell. The me that entered the cell is not the me that came out of the cell. And the one who came out of the cell was now connected. This one part of it that makes sense in terms of calling was now connected to mythology at a cellular, embodied level. And then from that, I eventually realized, that's what I'm called to do, to work in the area of mythology and stories and imagination. So I'm just giving that as one example. But that example includes the fact that everything had to be stripped away before I could have that experience and feel that deeply enough to transform or change from the person I had been to this other person that was waiting, or this other part of myself that was waiting to awaken. So I'm not saying it always has to be that dramatic. I'm saying look at those parts of one's life and you see the potential connection to unfinished initiatory experiences or to unfinished responses to a calling that has been trying to call all along. Excuse me. The getting a connection to this inner sense of genius or daimon gives a person an inner authority. When I was growing up, we were warned not to respect authority figures, and there's some sense in that. But there is an authority figure that really is important to respect. That is to say, the inner authority of our own soul. And the word authority begins with the word author. So that is to say, when we understand what's trying to live through us, what we came here to live, then we become closer to being an assistant author in the making of our own lives. But we also become closer to having some sense of inner authority, which is really important when the outside world makes no sense. We have to draw a sense of authority from somewhere, and this connection between the inner genius or daimon and the calling of one's life brings with it a kind of inner authority. And I'm using authority in its old sense, meaning the capacity to create and to add to life, rather than the capacity to dominate people, which is the misadventure and the misunderstanding and the misuse of authority in the contemporary world. And just to say, connected to that is the idea that the inner genius, the part of us that responds to the calling, will also drive us to do the hardest things we could possibly do and even thought we couldn't do. I'm repeating, the genius is not an aspect of the human person per se, it's spirit. And so it doesn't feel the need to stop and eat. like the painter who has a show coming and paints for days and days and doesn't sleep and doesn't eat. That's genius driving the person to express fully. And so one first problem was we haven't found the genius. The second problem is we found it, and now we have to figure out how to live with it. The first problem is we haven't found the calling. The second problem is we have found it, and now we have to find ways to respond to something that is much greater than ourselves in terms of vitality and in terms of a drive to express. And so the responding to the call puts us on a potential road of great vitality and great creativity, but it can be very demanding. And so then there has to be what's called negotiating with the spirit or negotiating with the genius. I'm repeating because it's not simply a human aspect, it's also a spiritual presence. So I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier. In growing older, the way that a person remains vital, exercise is good balance and nutrition is good, meditation is good, having friends is good. There's all kinds of things that are good. But what keeps a person young inside, which is a very common notion that a person can be old on the outside, young inside, what keeps a person young inside is a connection to the genius or the daimon, the inner spirit that was there at the very beginning. That's what keeps us young when we're old. And as a matter of fact, it was the connection to that inner spirit that from which came the idea of the fountain of youth. The fountain of youth doesn't exist somewhere. It exists inside. It's the ever-flowing fountain of imagination, ideas, and emotions that we can naturally have access to. And so I'm just saying for those of us that are growing older, the body has its aches and its pains and its growing incapacities, but the inner essence, the daimon, the inner spirit, and the genius is not affected or limited by those. And so a person can have a very vital inner life while actually experiencing a diminishing of life in other ways. And connected to that, I want to say one more thing, which is that there can be more than one calling in life. And if a person hasn't experienced the calling, then please know that the calling keeps calling. In other words, the calling is so important for the awakening of the soul of the person that it keeps calling all the way to the end. And there are stories of people on their deathbed realizing what the calling was. And I'm just putting that there as a way of encouragement. And maybe the last thing, because I see there are questions, is that vocation or calling doesn't simply mean identifying the path or the kind of work. It also means learning one's unique style of performing the work. Right? So the vocation isn't simply, oh, I'm going to become an artist, or oh, I'm going to become a healer, or oh, I'm going to become a psychologist. That is part of the calling, but the vocation includes the unique style in which and by which the person does the work. And that's what distinguishes one person from another and one vocation from another. Maybe it's also important to say, responding to the call or to the vocation gives a person a purpose in life. And just like the genius is there at the very beginning, woven into the soul of the person, the purpose of a person is there at the beginning, woven into the heart of a person. The idea is not to find a purpose out there, it's to awaken to the purpose that's already inside. That purpose is aligned with one's spirit and aligns with one's calling. And maybe the last comment about this is genius, or the inner spirit of a person is by its nature resilient. So we live in these hard times where things can change, shocking things occur. It happens all the time now. It's going to continue to happen. We're in that kind of period. And one of the most, and possibly the most resilient thing in a person is the spirit that they were born with. The spirit that came into the world with us is endlessly resilient. So when the world is hard and we're feeling easily discouraged or something, one way to find some resiliency is to turn to the inner spirit insofar as we know it, to realign with the genius that we came into the world with, or as they used to say, the genius that brought us into the world. That realignment gives us a capacity for resiliency that we cannot find otherwise. So I'll go to the questions. Can you differentiate between desire and calling? Well, a good question. Interesting to think about. Desire can go in many different ways. And so just hearing the word makes me think of eros and the love connections. And so a person can have great desire and meaningful love connections that can be parallel to, but not identical with the calling. So, and we can have desires of many kinds that can enrich our life and expand our identity, but they're not necessarily calling. I like the old word longing, that we come into the world longing, and some people say we're longing for the paradise that we left, and that's a nice idea. And then other people say we're longing for something beautiful, we're longing for the beautiful. And I like that word longing, that it's going to be with us all along, that it makes us have a longer life, that we're longing. And in that longing is, the presence of calling. We're longing to be called to have a meaningful life because we didn't come here just to survive or simply to grow. We came here to become a fully conscious version of our own self. And when that happens, we find some satisfaction, but we also find ourselves being able to contribute something to other people, and in times like this, possibly contributing to the healing of the world. That's desire. That's longing. That's calling. Can you give an example of genius hiding near the wound? I don't really understand what that looks like. Okay, so we've done a lot of work with at-risk youth. And by the way, most youth are at risk these days because the world is at risk. And so when you're working, you could be working in a high school in like a upper class area, where there's a lot of money is there in the high school, a lot of systems, a lot of teachers, a lot of support. And you can be working with young people there, and you can see some of their genius in the way some of them turn towards athletics and some turns towards academics and all the different things that young people do in order to grow and learn. But if you're working with at-risk youth, then they're not in the schools. They're not even in the system. They're in the streets. They're lost. They're homeless, or they're in gangs, whatever it is. They're messing with drugs. They're living la vida loca, the crazy life. And so you can't see them by their successes, because their successes look like crimes. So then you can only find their genius through the wounds. And I don't know, I just think of this one, we were working with these gangs in Chicago, and this one gang had a gang leader, really tough guy, unfortunately. I got to see how tough he was, and you could understand why he was the leader, but he was in pain, as most violent people are, as most conflicted people are. And he would have this way, he had authority in him that came out in the way he talked to people, which was just full of curses. And I began to focus on his cursing. And when I got to know him, I said, I figured something out about you. And he goes, what? I figured out that your genius is for language. He goes, what do you mean? I quit school. And I said, yeah, but you curse in a way that's almost Shakespearean. And he really got that. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I think your genius is to use language. And I know you're tough, but actually people follow you because of the way you use language, and you curse in a way that is highly creative. And I think that that's where your genius lies. And I have to tell you, that he wound up going to school, back to school, to college, and got some education in language, and became a mentor and a storyteller. So I hope that helps. But that can be true of anyone. It's just this idea deep inside us, related to each other, are the aspects of our own giftedness and our genius and the aspects of our own woundedness. And it becomes really important in this sense. When a person responds to the call and begins to live the life of their own genius and their own inner spirit, then that life is not just taking another step into a way of being creative or innovative or inventive or whatever the style is. That step also requires some healing of the inner woundedness. People carry both gifts and wounds. Everybody does. And when you see a young person, a starlet, or a young musician, or the kind of rising stars in contemporary culture through music or through film or even through the internet, rising stars, you watch them rise and they're bright like a star rising, and then soon enough they're in trouble and they begin to fall because they hit their woundedness. And a person is always carrying the gifts and the wounds. And so the nature of being on the paths of calling is to be both responding to the capacity to grow and be more generative, but also being attentive to our own woundedness. You look at the people who rise up in political places in modern countries and all, with the return of the dictators and the strongmen. They can have a certain kind of power and maybe luck, but they're very wounded and they cause damage because they've never dealt with their woundedness. And a person who doesn't know their own wounds will wound other people and often not feel regret. What's the difference between despair from ignoring the calling and despair resulting from the echoes of trauma or mental health difficulties? Thank you for the question. I'm not really sure. I don't know what is exactly being meant by the trauma and mental health. I don't know that those two despairs are all that different. I think the despair from rejecting or dismissing the calling involves a descent into dark places and feeling lost. And so that can have a similar resonance to being in the dark places of trauma or struggling with mental health issues. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. But I'll be thinking about it, and thank you for the question. A few days ago, a friend's adult son was found dead. How might those close to her best support her with such a devastation? Again, I'm sorry to hear that. When someone dies suddenly like that, it's a shock to their inner spirit, by the way, and it's a shock to everyone connected to them. And one thing that's problematic in the modern world, generally speaking, is people not knowing how to do funerals. And funerals used to be elaborate projects that involved the arts and poets and music and all kinds of things that were used in order to create vessels to hold the pain and the agony and all the loss, but also were the vessels that could then be turned and help guide people back to life. And so someone who has lost someone like that is pulled into, in ancient India, they call them the Bardo realms. You're in some other realm and nothing makes sense and it can be all darkness. And so people need to be with them. But then the burial process and the funeral process becomes way more important than modern culture allows for. And just to say, you typically in ancient cultures, you wouldn't bury a person just once. In ancient China, for instance, 1 year for an entire year, from the time a person dies until a year later, that someone would be hired to walk at a distance from the person who lost the deceased, the person suffering the loss. Someone would be dressed in white and walking at some distance wherever they went, as a reminder that you're still walking with the person who has passed. It was a way of outwardly showing the inner loss. And then after a year, there would be another funeral. It's like you never finish really mourning the dead, but you have to find ways to continually let go of them. And so these tragedies happen to people typically, commonly, more often, really. And there is no practice for it that in any way meets the depth of loss and the layers of agony and the needs of a person who has lost someone like that. And so, best wishes for them and for the rest of us, realizing we're in a culture that doesn't recognize the inner qualities trying to awaken and doesn't recognize the levels of loss and pain that we can experience through the loss of those we love, or even losses in our own lives. And so all that stuff is waiting to be reimagined and rediscovered. And for instance, one of the ways in which the calling can come is to people who become doulas or, death doulas. And the idea that people are learning again how to help other people die. That's a calling for some people. For some people, they couldn't handle it. Other people are called to that, and it makes sense to them. And so we are in a period of collapse and loss, which is, on the other hand, a period of awakening and renewal if we respond to the call. And I'm suggesting the calling is calling all the time. What practices would you recommend to help us be more receptive to hearing the call with more clarity? First thing that comes to mind is dreams. Everyone dreams. Not everybody remembers their dreams, but everyone dreams. And there are old cultures that have these great ideas, like all dreams come from the center of the cosmos. So when we're dreaming, we're as if we're in the dream time, as they would say in Aboriginal Australia. And the world began as a dream. So we're closer to the beginning of things. And so things that can't get through in the daily world will sometimes come through the dreams. And so when I first got intrigued with drumming, and for many times after that, when I lost touch with drumming, the drumming would come in a dream, as if to drum my awareness back and make me realize that I had been connected to something that had a lot to do with rhythm in my life and had a lot to do with finding a steadiness through the rhythm. And it comes back to this day, comes back through dreams as a reminder or as a reconnection. So dreams is that's one practice, I would say. And then the other practice I've already mentioned, but I want to go back to it, which is looking back over our lives. When I look back, and I've been alive for a long time now, it takes longer to look back. But honestly, when I look back, a whole lot of things disappear. I mean, all kinds of things that I hear other people talking about, but for me, they've disappeared. Certain aspects of early schooling and all kinds of stuff. But what stands out are these indelible experiences that are like markers on this road. And I can go to any of those markers and they're still alive. Like you can open them up and you can find things in them that you didn't realize when they happened, or didn't realize when you reviewed them, or even when you talked about them in therapy. And it turns out they're little fonts of knowledge. And so the practice of looking back and trying to extract from life experiences things that would relate to our inner character and our inner genius and what we're called to do in life. Those are two practices, I guess, I think of. What is a ritual practice to perform when literally at a crossroads in life, and what is your metaphorical take on crossroads? I can't tell if we're going a little astray here, but I love the idea of crossroads. So to begin with, the crossroads were not, the crossroads are horizontal. They were the places where the four directions would meet, which, by the way, in the middle is the fifth direction, which is connects all four directions and opens all four possible directions. And so it's interesting because that crossroads eventually became the cross. It was lifted up and it became a vertical image of a cross. But originally it was the crossroads. And the idea of the crossroads means you come to a place where you could take any number of roads. And so that's a meaningful place. It's literally a place of transformation. And so it's a place to be very attentive. And then one thing I would say about it is if we can stay at a crossroads in life and be humble enough to realize we don't know what we're doing. And so now I'll go back to mythology and stories, whether it's myths or fairy tales or folk tales. When the two older brothers or the two older sisters come into the crossroads, they act as if they know what's going on, and there's some old woman on the side with a dusty cloak calling to them, and they don't want to listen. They're on the way to something. They already think they know what they're doing. Why should they listen to her? And as a result, they get stuck somewhere and their life gets immobilized. Comes the youngest sister or the youngest brother who's more humble and less arrogant and enters the crossroads and realize they have no idea where they're going, which is really the first step to knowing where you're going is not knowing. And they hear the call from the old woman at the side of the road, and instead of moving on or feeling superior, they go over and rub her saws and begin to talk to her, and then she gives them the information about their own genius or about the calling that they need, and that allows them to pick the next road in that crossroads in order to go on. And so crossroads are a very powerful place, and I would say, in connecting it to what we're talking about, each time we come to a crossroads in our lives, our calling is calling more intently, and we have the opportunity to go further into that which our soul intends us to follow. Can you elaborate on what outside confirmation of one's calling might look like? It's a good question, because it has to be confirmed to be a calling. All on our own, we experience all kinds of things that are not true. We need someone outside ourselves. The humans are interdependent, and we need someone outside ourselves to confirm what is actually our own essence to begin with. And so I'm going through, this makes me think of mentors, because mentors are those who can confirm our gifts and even our callings. And so for me, so who's coming to mind is Robert Bly, and may he rest in peace, a once very well-known poet and cultural activist and wild character. And I happened to encounter him almost accidentally, and we made a connection. And at the time, I was experimenting with storytelling. I had been kept in touch with mythology since I was 13, but I thought it was like maybe a hobby or just a personal study. But then I had started experimenting with telling stories, and someone told me to go to see this event he was doing, and he was telling stories. He was reading poems, but he was also telling stories. And then when we made a connection, which happened in an uncanny kind of way, which is the way this stuff goes, he then very soon thereafter invited me to come and work at a conference where I told stories for the first time amongst people who actually understood that world. I didn't know that world myself. He invited me into a world I had never known about, where everyone there was doing something creative, and it was artists and musicians and all working together and at odds and all kinds of great things. I was in a conference that was like being called to a conference of imagination. And he felt that I belonged there, and that confirmed something that I was unsure of in myself. I hope that helps. When we move towards the calling, usually then the mentor appears, the guide appears. It's the same in fairy tales and folk myths and so on, and it's also the same for us. Does the call evolve and deepen in the second phase of life? And is the deepening related to time or to pursuing the call? I'll answer the second part first. The deepening is related to pursuing the call. Time doesn't do it. It's beyond time what's going on. And so you don't, it's not simply that experience can make a difference. It's the awakened nature of an experience that makes a difference. And so, yes, I think the calling deepens and it grows throughout life. I think that's what happens. And if you remember, the idea is because each soul is unique, the way each soul deals with the gifts and the genius and the calling is unique. And so as we grow older, we find more unique ways of doing it. I think I was calling it the style. So it's not just that someone is a musician, but it's they have their own style for doing it. It's not just that someone's a healer. They have their own style for doing it. It's not just that someone works with people in terms of psychology, but they find their own way of doing it. And so as we stick with it, whether it's the second phase of life, the second adventure, or anywhere along where we gain more experience and we have more knowledge of it, then we develop our style further. And so therefore we are more embedded in us. It's more awakened in us. And that makes it more possible to give from that place, both benefit from that place, maybe derive some satisfaction, find some sense of honest or authentic authority, but also whenever we realize that our gifts were given to us, we become more aware that we need to give them to others. And the strange thing about the gifts of the soul, the genius qualities, the more we give them, they're not diminished, they actually grow greater. And so there's this great benefit of sticking with things for a long time and realizing more comfort with them, more knowledge about them, and then they become more present. We become more present. We actually have both more being and more authentic authority. And then we give those things more freely. And in doing that, they are more present with us. So maybe that's the place to stop. And we're hoping that that's true and everybody can find their way there. And I will maybe pull one other thread, which is as a person answers a call and goes deeper and deeper into places of meaning, which means deeper and deeper into knowledge of one's own self and also healing of one's wounds, it becomes really important to be connected to other people who are doing similar things. You could call it friends of the soul. Carl Jung called it friends of the deep self. Because you can become isolated in your own knowledge. You can become isolated in your own giftedness. You can be isolated in your own genius. And that's not the intention. And so there's an aspect of it which is developing friends of the soul or friends of the deep self. All right. So we've reached the end, but I like to end with poems. This is William Stafford, great American poet, lived most of his life in Oregon, in Portland, died maybe 17 years ago, and I had the good fortune of working with him. And he wrote all these small, beautiful poems. And this one is called When I Met My Muse. Muse is similar to genius and daimon. I glanced at her and took my glasses off, and they were still singing. They buzzed like a locust on the coffee table and then ceased. And her voice belled forth, and the sunlight bent, and I felt the ceiling arch and knew that the nails up there took a new grip on whatever they touched. I am your own way of looking at things, she said. When you allow me to live with you, every glance at the world around you will be a sort of salvation. And I took her hand. I love that poem. So this is the genius or the daimon or the muse speaking to, in this case, the poet. I am your own way of looking at things, she said. When you allow me to live with you, every glance at the world around you will be a sort of salvation. And I took her hand. The muse, the daimon, the genius, as companion, as guardian angel, as protecting spirit, and as guide. Great one. Okay, maybe this is the last one. This is Hafez. It's very brief. and it's intended to be funny, but it carries a truth. It's called manic, my friend. We should make all spiritual talk very simple today. God is trying to sell you something, but you don't want to buy. That's the true nature of all your suffering, your fantastic haggling, and your manic screaming over the price. So what he's saying is, there's a cost for answering the call. There's a cost for going the way of the spirit, the way of the soul. And sometimes we just have to make talk very simple and say, God, the divine, is trying to sell each of us something, and we're all resisting buying the whole thing. Either that, or we're haggling over and madly screaming over the price. There's a price to pay. It was brought up, the idea that you might have to leave loved ones, or you have to separate from family, or you have to leave certain aspects of life behind in order to be on the meaningful path of calling and awakening. That's the price to pay. And according to the poets, according to the seers, according to the healers, according to the makers, it's worth the price. And I'm sticking with them. I'm counting on them, and all the stories that say each person that's born into this world brings a genius spirit with them. And the awakening of that inner spirit is the reward for being alive. And it also allows each of us to bring something to a world that needs many, many things at this time. Near as I can tell, that's a legitimate story. That's a whole story. That's an old story. That's an endless story. And I'm sticking with that. Thank you.